It is May 1940. Night has settled over Britain, heavy and uncertain, pressing down on streets, rooftops, and quiet rooms where sleep no longer comes easily. Across the Channel, Europe is already burning. One country after another has fallen into silence, their borders erased, their cities dimmed, their futures abruptly narrowed. The world feels smaller now, as if history itself has begun to close in. In London, doubt hangs in the air, sirens wait without sounding, maps are redrawn again and again beneath tired hands. Messages arrive in the early hours of the morning, each one carrying more bad news than the last. And in a room lit long after midnight, an aging man prepares to speak, not because he is certain of victory, but because there is no one else left to take the weight of what must be said. His name is Winston Churchill. He is not widely trusted. He is not universally admired. Many believe he is a mistake, a relic from another age, a man of words in a time when words seem painfully inadequate. His past is filled with failures, misjudgments, and long years spent in political isolation. Even now, some whisper that he will not last. And yet, in Britain's darkest hours, it is his voice that will steady a nation, not with promises of safety or quick triumph, but with resolve, endurance, and a refusal to look away from the truth. He will speak of hardship, of struggle, of nights that must be endured before dawn can be imagined. Tonight, we follow the quiet story behind those words, the doubts hidden behind public confidence, and the solitude that comes with leadership when the fate of millions rests on a single voice. So settle in now and let the world grow still. This is the bedtime history of Winston Churchill and the long night he helped Britain survive. May 1940 arrives without ceremony. There are no bells, no declarations that announce the turning of history. There is only a quiet, creeping sense that something has slipped out of place. Across Europe, the old order is collapsing with alarming speed. Poland has fallen, Norway has been broken, Belgium and the Netherlands are trembling, and now France, long thought unassailable, is beginning to fold in on itself. In Britain, the nights grow longer, not because of the season, but because sleep comes less easily. Radios murmur late into the evening. Newspapers are read and reread, as if the words might change on the page. People sense that the familiar world, the one they assumed would always hold, is no longer guaranteed. Inside the halls of government, exhaustion settles in like fog. The previous Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, has lost the confidence of Parliament. His policy of appeasement, once defended as necessary and pragmatic, now feels hollow. The country needs leadership, but it is not clear where it will come from. There are names, of course, but none inspire certainty. The moment demands strength, clarity, and resolve, yet those qualities feel in short supply. And so, almost reluctantly, the task falls to Winston Churchill. He is 65 years old. He has been in politics for decades, long enough to be associated with past failures as much as past achievements. Many remember Gallipoli. Others remember his shifting party loyalties, his warnings that once sounded excessive, even embarrassing. He is admired by some, tolerated by others, and distrusted by many. Few see him as a unifying figure. Fewer still believe he will bring calm. Churchill himself understands this better than anyone. He does not step into power with illusions of grandeur. He knows the country is frightened. He knows the odds are poor. He knows that Britain may soon stand entirely alone. Late at night, surrounded by papers and maps, he studies the reports with a heavy awareness that there are no good options left, only choices that carry different kinds of loss. Outside, the city remains darkened. Windows are covered, streetlights are dimmed. The threat of air raids hangs unspoken in the background, like a held breath. London listens to the sky even in silence. Somewhere beyond the horizon, German forces are moving, methodically and relentlessly, reshaping the continent with terrifying efficiency. Churchill feels the weight of it all settle onto his shoulders. Leadership in this moment does not feel like authority. It feels like responsibility without escape. Every decision will cost lives. Every delay may close another door. The margin for error has narrowed to almost nothing. Yet something within him steadies rather than breaks. Not confidence exactly, but acceptance. He has spent years imagining this moment, warning of it, rehearsing it in his mind while others looked away. Now that it has arrived, he does not turn from it. He understands that fear, left unspoken, grows sharper in the dark. If the country is to endure, it must be told the truth, even when the truth offers no comfort. On his first day as Prime Minister, Churchill writes in his diary that he feels destiny walking with him. It is not a boast, it is an acknowledgement. All the detours, the mistakes, the long years in political exile have led him here, to this narrow bridge between collapse and survival. Soon he will speak to Parliament. He will not promise victory. He will not pretend the path ahead is anything but brutal. He will offer only what he believes is honest: effort, sacrifice, endurance. It is not much, and yet it is everything. For now, though, the night holds. The world waits. And one man, surrounded by darkness, prepares to find the words that might carry a nation through until morning. Winston Churchill did not arrive in power carried by hope or enthusiasm. His appointment was not the result of trust, but of exhaustion. The usual options had failed, and the country found itself turning not toward its favorite son, but toward a man it had never fully embraced. For years, Churchill had been difficult to place. He spoke too much when others preferred restraint. He warned too loudly when compromise felt more comfortable. His career was marked by reversals and controversy, moments that critics stored carefully, waiting for the chance to bring them back into the light. To many, he seemed reckless, impulsive, a man shaped by an older world that no longer existed. Even within his own party, support was fragile. There were those who feared that Churchill would provoke rather than protect, that his refusal to soften reality would only deepen panic. Others questioned his judgment entirely. Gallipoli still lingered in memory, a symbol of ambition gone wrong, of lives lost under his watch. The past, it seemed, refused to let him pass quietly into the present. Churchill knew all of this. He was acutely aware of how he was seen, how often he had been underestimated or dismissed. He carried the weight of those judgments with him, not defensively, but deliberately, as if he had learned long ago that approval was never guaranteed. What mattered now was not whether he was liked, but whether he could endure. In private, he was far from calm. Doubt visited him often, usually late at night, when the noise of the day finally receded. He questioned his own decisions, replayed old failures, wondered whether his instincts would betray him again. But he also understood something that others did not yet fully grasp. Hesitation, at this moment, would be fatal. The world was moving too fast for caution disguised as wisdom. Around him, voices still argued for negotiation, for compromise, for a way out that did not require total commitment. Churchill listened, but he did not agree. He had watched the pattern unfold again and again, promises made and broken, lines drawn and erased. Appeasement had not brought peace. It had only postponed reckoning. Now, postponement was no longer an option. What made Churchill dangerous to his critics was not his stubbornness, but his clarity. He did not believe the situation could be managed quietly. He believed it had to be faced directly, named honestly, endured collectively. This made him uncomfortable to listen to. People prefer reassurance, even when it is false. Churchill offered none. He was also undeniably a man of contradictions. He could be warm and cutting within the same breath, generous one moment and merciless the next. His moods shifted. His habits were unconventional. He worked late, slept little, drank more than seemed wise, To some, this only confirmed their fears. To others, it suggested a man already accustomed to living at the edge of exhaustion. Yet beneath the surface, something steadier held him together. Churchill had learned through years of isolation how to stand without reinforcement. The long political wilderness of the 1930s, when his warnings were ignored and his presence tolerated at best, had stripped away the illusion that recognition was necessary for purpose. He had learned to continue speaking even when no one applauded. Now, as Britain faced its greatest threat in centuries, that strange resilience became its quiet advantage. Churchill did not expect gratitude. He did not rely on consensus. He accepted, almost calmly, that leadership in such a moment meant bearing the weight of disapproval alongside responsibility. He once said that courage was rightly considered the first of human qualities because it guaranteed all the others. In May of 1940, courage did not look like bold gestures or dramatic victories. It looked like standing firm in uncertainty, speaking plainly when silence felt safer, and accepting the loneliness that came with difficult truths. Churchill had not been chosen because he was beloved. He had been chosen because he was willing to say what others would not. And as Britain moved deeper into its darkest hours, that unwillingness to look away would prove more valuable than comfort ever could. Long before the weight of a nation rested on his shoulders, Winston Churchill learned what it meant to feel alone. His childhood unfolded not in warmth and reassurance, but in distance, formality, and quiet longing. He was born into privilege, surrounded by symbols of status and expectation, yet affection itself often felt just out of reach. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was brilliant, intense, and remote. A rising star in British politics, he carried himself with authority but little patience, especially for weakness. Winston admired him deeply and feared him just as much. Praise, when it came at all, was rare. Disappointment was easier to sense than approval, and the boy learned early that love was something to be earned, not assumed. His mother, Jenny, was charismatic and admired, moving easily through society, her attention divided among obligations, friendships, and admirers. She loved her son, but her presence was fleeting, more visible in letters than in daily life. Winston would later read those letters again and again, searching them for reassurance, for some sign that he truly mattered. At school, the sense of isolation deepened. Winston was small, often ill, and painfully sensitive. He struggled with discipline and routine, finding himself out of step with expectations that came easily to others. Punishment was frequent, encouragement was not. He felt misunderstood, labeled as slow or difficult, when in truth his mind simply moved in a different rhythm. Loneliness became a familiar companion. While other boys found belonging in games and camaraderie, Winston retreated inward. He learned to observe rather than participate, to listen more than speak. In those quiet spaces, imagination took root. Stories, histories, and words began to offer what the world around him withheld, a sense of meaning, continuity, and refuge. There were moments of shame that stayed with him, failures remembered too clearly, criticism absorbed too deeply. He would later write about what he called the black dog, a shadow of sadness that followed him through life. Its presence can be traced back to these early years when vulnerability met indifference and learned to armor itself in silence. Yet something else was forming alongside the pain. Isolation sharpened his awareness. Being on the outside taught him to see patterns others missed, to notice the emotional undercurrents beneath formal surfaces. He became attentive to tone, to implication, to the power of language, not just to describe, but to protect. When praise finally came, it mattered intensely. When it did not, he learned to survive without it. The absence of easy affection forced him to develop an inner world, sturdy enough to hold disappointment. Over time, solitude became not only a wound, but a training ground. Churchill's childhood did not prepare him for comfort. It prepared him for endurance. It taught him how to sit with unease, how to persist without reassurance, how to find strength in imagination when reality felt cold. These were quiet lessons, learned slowly and at great emotional cost. Years later, as Prime Minister, Churchill would spend long hours alone, thinking, writing, wrestling with doubt in the silence of night. The loneliness of leadership would feel familiar, almost expected. He had known it before, long before the war, in the quiet corridors of childhood where resilience was forged without witnesses. The boy who felt alone did not disappear. He grew, hardened, and learned to speak, and in time the very solitude that once wounded him would allow him to stand steady when the world itself began to feel unbearably alone. In a childhood marked by distance and uncertainty, Winston Churchill discovered something that did not withdraw or disappoint him. Words, unlike people, remained where he left them. They waited patiently on the page, offering meaning without judgment, structure without coldness. In them, he found a refuge that asked nothing in return. Reading became his first quiet sanctuary. History, biography, and poetry opened worlds that felt larger and more forgiving than the one immediately around him. In books, he encountered figures who had struggled, failed, endured, and continued. Their lives unfolded with clarity and purpose, offering patterns that real life rarely revealed so cleanly. To a boy who often felt misunderstood, these voices from the past felt steady and reassuring. Writing followed naturally. At first it was hesitant, almost private, a way of ordering thoughts that otherwise crowded his mind. Words allowed him to slow the world down, to examine it carefully, to choose how it should be framed. Where spoken conversation could be awkward or uncertain, writing offered control. Each sentence could be shaped, revised, strengthened. Each idea could be given weight and balance. Churchill struggled with speech in his early years. He spoke with a noticeable impediment, and this only deepened his self-consciousness. But rather than retreat entirely, he practiced relentlessly. He read aloud. He memorized passages. He trained his voice as one might train a muscle, patiently and without spectacle. The effort was quiet, almost invisible, but it changed him. Words were no longer only something he consumed. They became something he could wield. Language taught him rhythm. He began to sense how sentences moved, how cadence could carry emotion, how repetition could reinforce resolve. Long before he stood before microphones and parliaments, he was already listening for the music within language, the way a phrase could settle into memory and stay there. Writing also gave him distance from his own emotions. When sadness or frustration pressed too closely, words allowed him to step back and observe rather than be overwhelmed. He could transform feeling into narrative, pain into structure. In doing so, he learned a vital skill: how to face difficult truths without being undone by them. There was comfort in this discipline. While the world around him felt unpredictable, language offered reliability. A sentence once written did not change its meaning overnight. A paragraph did not abandon him. Over time, this consistency built trust. Words became not only expression, but shelter. As he grew older, Churchill carried this refuge with him. Whether in moments of failure or isolation, he returned again and again to language. He wrote articles, letters, histories, reflections. Writing became a way of anchoring himself, of reaffirming identity when circumstances threatened to erode it. Much later, in the darkest hours of war, this early relationship with words would reveal its deeper purpose. The refuge he had built in childhood would expand beyond himself. The sentences he learned to shape in solitude would one day steady millions. The rhythm he practiced in quiet rooms would echo through radios and halls, offering not escape but endurance. For now, though, it was enough that words gave him a place to stand. In them, the boy who felt alone found something solid, something that held, and slowly, almost without realizing it, he was preparing for a future in which language would become his greatest strength. As Winston Churchill moved out of childhood and toward adulthood, the shelter of words was tested by the weight of expectation. The world beyond books demanded results, discipline, and conformity, and here failure arrived sooner than success. It did not come dramatically but persistently, in small judgments and quiet disappointments that accumulated over time. His early education had already marked him as a difficult student, but the pattern continued as he entered the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. Admission itself was not easy. He failed the entrance examination twice, each rejection reinforcing the quiet fear that he might never measure up. When he was finally accepted, it felt less like triumph and more like relief, a temporary reprieve from the shadow of inadequacy. At Sandhurst, effort mattered, but natural ease mattered more. Churchill worked diligently, yet he rarely stood out in the ways his instructors valued most. He was not the fastest, not the strongest, not the most precise. His progress was uneven, his mistakes visible. Each misstep felt amplified by the unspoken comparison to his father's brilliance, a standard that seemed impossibly high and relentlessly present. Failure in these years was not simply academic, it was personal. Each setback reinforced a deeper doubt about belonging, about worth, about whether he possessed the qualities required for distinction. While others appeared confident in their path, Churchill questioned his own, uncertain whether perseverance alone could compensate for what he seemed to lack. And yet something within him resisted surrender. He learned to endure embarrassment without retreat, to absorb criticism without vanishing into silence. Failure, repeated often enough, lost some of its sting. It became familiar, even instructive. Where success might have softened him, failure hardened his resolve. There were moments of genuine despair. Letters to his mother reveal anxiety and longing for reassurance, a quiet plea for acknowledgement that rarely arrived in full. He oscillated between hope and discouragement, pushing forward while fearing that effort might never be enough. What distinguished Churchill was not brilliance in these early years, but persistence. He returned to his work after setbacks, refined his weaknesses, and continued despite the lack of immediate reward. In doing so, he developed a tolerance for disappointment that would later prove essential. The ability to fail without retreating became one of his most enduring strengths. Failure also sharpened his awareness of time. He understood that progress was rarely immediate, that achievement often lagged far behind intention. This awareness fostered patience, a willingness to endure long stretches of uncertainty without abandoning purpose. By the time he left Sandhurst, Churchill had not emerged as a prodigy or a natural leader. He left as someone tempered by struggle, familiar with doubt, and accustomed to standing slightly apart. It was not the kind of beginning that inspires confidence in others, but it was one that quietly prepared him for a life where failure would recur, often publicly, and survival would depend on resilience rather than approval. Long before the world would judge him on a grand scale, Churchill had already learned how to live with judgment. Failure had come early, but it had also taught him something rare: how to continue when confidence was fragile and certainty absent. And in that quiet endurance, the foundations of future leadership were slowly taking shape. When Winston Churchill finally left the structured corridors of military school, the world did not open gently before him. It greeted him instead with dust, heat, and the unfamiliar sound of distant gunfire. War, which had lived so long in books and imagination, now revealed itself as something far less orderly and far more indifferent. His first postings took him far from England, into landscapes that felt vast and impersonal. The routines of military life offered a certain clarity, but they also stripped away illusion. Days were long, nights were uneasy. The body learned to remain alert even when rest was demanded. Fear arrived quietly, without drama, settling into the background like a low, constant hum. Churchill observed everything closely. He noticed how quickly theory dissolved under pressure, how plans unraveled once they met terrain and chance. Orders were given with confidence, Yet outcomes remained uncertain. The sound of gunfire, once distant and abstract, now carried weight. It was irregular, unpredictable, and final in a way that no description could soften. As a young officer, he felt the tension between responsibility and powerlessness. Decisions mattered, yet control was limited. Men followed commands, trusting that someone else had calculated the risks. Churchill felt the burden of that trust keenly. Even early on, he sensed that leadership was not about certainty, but about acting despite its absence. There were moments of exhilaration, brief flashes of intensity that sharpened the senses and narrowed focus. But these moments passed quickly, replaced by fatigue and reflection. War was not continuous action. It was waiting, discomfort, and sudden disruption. It taught patience through monotony and humility through surprise. Churchill also learned how fragile composure could be. Courage did not always announce itself. Sometimes it appeared as routine, as habit, as the simple decision to continue moving forward when instinct urged retreat. He watched others closely, noting how fear expressed itself differently in each man. Some grew quiet, others spoke too much, a few withdrew entirely. These observations stayed with him. He began to understand that bravery was not a single quality, but a spectrum of responses to pressure. This understanding would later shape how he spoke to others, how he framed endurance not as heroism, but as persistence. The experience altered his relationship with danger. He did not become reckless, but he did become familiar with risk. The presence of threat no longer paralyzed him. Instead, it sharpened his awareness, forced clarity where hesitation had once lived. He learned that fear could coexist with action, that the two were not opposites, but companions. In the quiet moments between engagements, Churchill returned to writing. He recorded impressions, described scenes, and reflected on the dissonance between expectation and reality. Writing remained his anchor, a way of processing what could not be spoken easily. Through words, he imposed order on experiences that otherwise resisted understanding. By the time his early military service drew to a close, Churchill was no longer the same young man who had left Sandhurst. He had heard the sound of gunfire and felt its implications settle into him. War had not made him certain, but it had made him attentive. It had taught him to look steadily at danger without illusion. These lessons would not fade. Long after the echoes of those early conflicts had quieted, the memory of gunfire would return in another form, carried across continents and decades. And when it did, Churchill would remember what he had learned early on, that clarity often arrives not in moments of peace, but in the presence of threat, when there is no choice but to listen carefully and endure. Fate has a way of changing direction without warning. For Winston Churchill, it did so not through promotion or praise, but through capture. During the Boer War in South Africa, a routine mission ended abruptly when his armored train was ambushed. Chaos followed. Smoke, shouting, confusion. And then, suddenly, the war narrowed to a single moment, and he found himself taken prisoner. Captivity was not dramatic in the way stories often suggest. It was quiet, enclosed, and disorienting. The days passed slowly, measured not by action but by waiting. The future felt uncertain, suspended between possibility and resignation. For a young man already familiar with self-doubt, the loss of freedom pressed heavily on the mind. Churchill was held in a prison camp, surrounded by men who shared his fate but not his temperament. Some adjusted quickly, finding routines within confinement. Others grew restless or withdrawn. Churchill observed them all, as he always did, attentive to how circumstance reshaped character. He felt the weight of captivity, not only as a physical condition, but as a test of identity. Who was he when stripped of movement, choice, and direction? The idea of escape did not arrive fully formed. It emerged gradually, almost quietly, as a refusal to accept stillness as permanent. Churchill studied patterns, distances, habits. He memorized details not with bravado, but with patience. Escape, he understood, would not be an act of defiance alone. It would be an act of endurance. When the moment came, it came without ceremony. He slipped away into the night, carrying little more than determination and uncertainty. The journey that followed was exhausting and precarious. Hunger, fear, and isolation accompanied him as he moved through unfamiliar terrain, relying on chance encounters and the kindness of strangers. Each step carried risk. Each decision narrowed the margin between survival and failure. Yet he continued, not because success was assured, but because stopping felt impossible. In motion there was hope, in stillness none. When he finally reached safety, the relief was profound but brief. The world was already reshaping the story. News of the escape traveled quickly. Newspapers seized upon it, transforming a fragile, uncertain journey into a narrative of daring and resolve. Churchill became a figure of fascination, a young officer who had defied captivity and returned against the odds. The public remembered the triumph, not the fear. The escape became legend. For Churchill, the attention was both affirming and unsettling. He recognized how easily complexity dissolved into myth. The quiet moments of doubt, the dependence on luck, the vulnerability of being alone and afraid, these did not survive retelling. What remained was an image, sharpened and simplified. This was his first encounter with public memory, and it left a lasting impression. He learned how stories could be shaped, how events could be distilled into symbols that served broader needs. He also learned that recognition did not necessarily bring understanding. Being remembered did not mean being known. Still, the escape changed him. It reinforced a belief that persistence mattered, that movement itself could alter fate. It also gave him confidence, not in invincibility, but in his capacity to endure uncertainty and continue forward. The experience followed him long after the headlines faded. It reminded him that survival was rarely heroic in the moment, and that history often softened the edges of reality. Years later, when others would look to him as a symbol of defiance, Churchill would remember the quieter truth behind that first legend. A man alone, moving through darkness, guided less by certainty than by the simple refusal to remain confined. Fame, Churchill soon discovered, did not lead naturally to belonging. When he entered politics, he did so with visibility but without certainty, known to many yet fully trusted by few. The public remembered the escape, the daring story carried by newspapers, but politics demanded something quieter and far less forgiving. It required patience, loyalty, and an ability to remain still within rigid structures. From the beginning, Churchill felt out of step. His temperament was restless, his opinions too fluid for those who preferred clear lines and steady allegiances. He spoke with confidence, but often before the room was ready to listen. His ambition was evident, and ambition rarely invites warmth. Allies were cautious, rivals were alert. He moved between political parties, driven by conviction as much as opportunity, but this only deepened suspicion. To some, he appeared unreliable, unwilling to settle, guided by personal judgment rather than collective discipline. The charge of inconsistency followed him, repeated often enough to harden into reputation. Churchill understood the damage this caused, yet he could not quiet the instinct that pushed him to speak when conscience demanded. Inside Parliament, isolation took on a new form. It was no longer the quiet loneliness of childhood or the contained uncertainty of military life. It was public, visible, shaped by glances, silences, and the subtle exclusion that accompanies dissent. He sat among others, yet often felt apart, listening to debates that seemed to circle around problems without touching their core. He learned quickly that politics rewarded caution more readily than clarity. Compromise was praised as wisdom. Delay was framed as responsibility. Churchill watched as decisions softened under pressure, their urgency diluted by procedure. This unsettled him. He sensed that avoidance, repeated often enough, could become habit, and habit could become danger. There were moments of progress, brief periods when his energy found alignment with opportunity. He held office, spoke forcefully, wrote constantly. Yet even in success, he felt the precariousness of his position. Approval arrived conditionally. easily withdrawn. One misstep could reopen every old doubt, every remembered failure. Writing remained his refuge. When the chamber emptied and voices faded, he returned to language, setting down his thoughts with the same care he had learned in youth. Writing allowed him to clarify what debate often obscured. It also preserved a sense of continuity when political life felt fragmented and uncertain. As years passed, the sense of standing apart deepened. Churchill noticed how often he found himself warning rather than agreeing, resisting rather than following. This was not a role chosen lightly. It came with fatigue, with the quiet knowledge that being right too early could be indistinguishable from being wrong. Isolation once again became a familiar condition, yet it no longer felt entirely accidental. Churchill began to understand that certain paths, once taken, narrowed the space for companionship. Conviction required distance. Independence carried cost. The comfort of consensus was exchanged for the discomfort of foresight. This period shaped him profoundly. It taught him how to function without affirmation, how to persist while surrounded by doubt. He learned to separate purpose from popularity, to measure success not by applause but by coherence between belief and action. Politics did not soften Churchill. It refined him. It stripped away expectations of easy alignment and replaced them with endurance. And as the world beyond Britain began to shift in unsettling ways, this long familiarity with isolation would prepare him, quietly and without spectacle, for the moment when standing alone would no longer be a disadvantage, but a necessity. The 1930s arrived without drama, but with a quiet sense of closing doors. For Winston Churchill, these years would later be called the wilderness years, a long stretch of time marked not by power or influence, but by distance. He remained visible, still speaking, still writing, yet increasingly unheard. The world moved forward, and he found himself left behind. From the benches of Parliament, Churchill watched as others set the tone of policy and debate. His warnings, once delivered with urgency, now met polite dismissal. He spoke of rearmament, of gathering danger, of a Germany reshaping itself with alarming speed. But his words fell into a room that preferred reassurance. The memory of the Great War was still too raw. Peace, even fragile peace, felt precious. Many believed that calm could be preserved through patience and restraint. Churchill sensed something different. He read reports carefully, followed developments closely, and felt the pattern forming beneath the surface. He understood how quickly disorder could solidify into threat, how easily hesitation could be mistaken for wisdom. Yet the more insistently he spoke, the more isolated he became. His tone was described as alarmist, his perspective outdated. The past failures attached to his name made it easy to doubt his judgment. Outside of politics, life narrowed further. Invitations dwindled. Influence faded. The sense of being peripheral, once familiar, now deepened into something heavier. He had known loneliness before, but this was different. This was the loneliness of conviction without audience, of clarity without authority. He filled the silence with work. Writing became not just refuge, but necessity. He turned to history, composing long narratives of conflict and character, tracing the rise and fall of empires as if searching for patterns that might still instruct the present. These works sustained him financially and intellectually, but they also reinforced his separation from immediate power. He was becoming a commentator on history rather than a participant in it. Yet the distance sharpened him. Removed from daily compromise, he thought more freely, more deeply. He examined events without the pressure to please or align. In isolation, his perspective widened. He studied not only military developments, but the psychology of nations, the slow erosion of restraint, the seductive appeal of certainty in uncertain times. At home, evenings grew quiet. Churchill painted, finding calm in color and form, another way to steady the mind when words felt insufficient. He walked, reflected, and waited. There was frustration, certainly, and moments of bitterness. But there was also patience, learned slowly and imperfectly. He understood that history did not always reward early recognition. Sometimes it required endurance without acknowledgement. The wilderness was not merely absence, it was preparation. These years forced him to confront the possibility that he might never be called upon again, that his warnings might remain footnotes rather than turning points. As the decade progressed, the world began to catch up to what he had long feared. Events accelerated, borders shifted, assurances weakened. Still, Churchill remained outside the center of decision-making, watching as choices were made that narrowed the future. The wilderness years stripped away illusion. They taught him how to exist without validation, how to continue speaking even when silence answered back. They hardened his resolve without extinguishing reflection. And when the world finally changed course, abruptly and violently, it would turn not to the comfortable voices of consensus, but to the man who had learned, in long solitude, how to stand firm without company. As the decade moved forward, the signs grew harder to ignore, yet the world seemed determined to look away. Agreements were signed with solemn ceremony. Promises were made in public, celebrated as victories for peace. Each time, relief followed briefly, like a shallow breath taken after holding fear at bay. And each time, the relief faded just as quickly. Churchill watched this pattern repeat with a growing sense of unease. He listened to speeches filled with confidence and restraint, heard leaders speak of honor and mutual understanding, and felt the quiet certainty that these words rested on hope rather than evidence. He did not doubt the desire for peace. He doubted the belief that desire alone could secure it. Germany was changing, openly and rapidly. Rearmament accelerated. Rhetoric hardened, borders were tested, then crossed. Each step was met with explanation, each violation reframed as an exception. Churchill saw in this a familiar rhythm, one he recognized from history. Concession once offered demanded repetition. Silence, once chosen, invited escalation. Still, his warnings remained unwelcome. The public, exhausted by memory of war, clung to reassurance. Newspapers favored calm voices over troubling ones. To question the prevailing mood was to risk being labeled disruptive, even irresponsible. Churchill's insistence on preparedness felt to many like a threat to the fragile calm they wished to preserve. Inside Parliament, debates unfolded with careful language and measured pauses. Decisions were delayed, committees formed, time passed. Churchill spoke when allowed, his words steady but increasingly solitary. He understood that fear often seeks comfort, and comfort often disguises itself as reason. The refusal to listen was not rooted in ignorance alone, but in fatigue, in the deep human wish that danger might resolve itself without confrontation. Privately, he felt the strain of repetition. To warn continuously without effect is a particular kind of burden. Each speech that failed to alter course weighed heavier than the last. He questioned his own persistence, wondered whether he was trapped in a role that history would judge as misguided. Yet the evidence before him did not change, and so neither did his voice. At home, evenings grew heavier. Maps spread across tables. Reports accumulated. He studied movements and intentions, tracing lines that others preferred to leave blurred. The future, to him, appeared increasingly narrow. Choices that once seemed available were closing, one by one, through inaction. He also sensed something else taking shape beneath policy and diplomacy, a shift in moral atmosphere. The willingness to overlook injustice for the sake of stability troubled him deeply. He believed that compromise, when divorced from principle, carried consequences beyond immediate strategy. Silence, too, had a cost. As Europe edged closer to conflict, Churchill felt both urgency and resignation. He could not force the world to listen. He could only continue to speak, placing his words into a space that often returned them unchanged. This persistence resistance was not driven by confidence of success, but by conviction. To stop warning would be to accept a silence he could not bear. History, he knew, rarely announces its turning points clearly. Often they pass unnoticed until their consequences are unavoidable. The world in these years stood at such a threshold, and while many looked elsewhere, hoping the moment would pass, Churchill remained fixed on it, aware that the cost of not listening would soon become impossible to deny. The refusal to listen did not last forever. It could not. Events were gathering momentum, indifferent to preference or delay, and when the world finally turned, it would do so abruptly, leaving behind the comfort of gradual change. In that moment, the voice long ignored would be sought again, not for reassurance, but for direction. Silence does not end gently, it fractures. For years, Europe had lived inside a careful quiet, sustained by agreements, reassurances, and the hope that restraint might be enough. When the break finally came, it arrived not as a surprise, but as a confirmation of what had long been feared and quietly denied. In September of 1939, war returned to Europe. The words were spoken formally, carried over radios and printed in newspapers, but their meaning settled slowly. Declarations do not immediately alter the rhythm of daily life. People still woke, worked, and waited. Yet beneath these routines, something irreversible had shifted. The future was no longer hypothetical. For Churchill, the outbreak of war brought no satisfaction. There was no sense of being vindicated, only a quiet heaviness, the knowledge that warning had failed and consequence had arrived. He was called back into government, appointed First Lord of the Admiralty, returning to a position he had held decades earlier. The past, once used against him, now returned as qualification. The corridors of power felt familiar, yet altered. Faces were older, assumptions more fragile. The certainty that had once guided decisions was gone, replaced by urgency and improvisation. Churchill worked relentlessly, sleeping little, absorbing reports late into the night. The sea lanes mattered again. Ships moved under threat. Signals carried weight. Outside, Britain adjusted unevenly to the reality of war. Blackout curtains appeared in windows. Sirens were tested. Children were evacuated. These changes unfolded gradually, but their meaning was unmistakable. The country was preparing itself not for brief conflict but for endurance. Churchill sensed the shift in tone immediately. Conversations grew more direct. The language of hope gave way to the language of necessity. There was less patience for ambiguity. Decisions were demanded, even when information remained incomplete. Silence, once cultivated, was no longer an option. Still, the early months of war were marked by waiting. Little seemed to happen, at least on the surface. This period, later called the Phony War, carried its own strain. Anticipation without release can be as exhausting as action. Churchill understood this well. He knew how uncertainty eroded morale, how prolonged tension could dull resolve. He continued to speak, now with authority, yet still with restraint. He avoided false confidence. He spoke instead of vigilance, of preparation, of the long view. The tone he adopted was measured, neither alarmist nor soothing. It reflected his understanding that the war ahead would not be won quickly, if at all. Then, in the spring of 1940, the waiting ended. Germany moved with speed and force. Norway fell. Denmark followed. The illusion of containment collapsed. Events accelerated beyond the control of careful planning. The machinery of war, once restrained by diplomacy, now advanced openly. In Britain, confidence in leadership faltered. The government appeared hesitant, reactive. Questions grew louder. The silence that had protected reputations now exposed weakness. Churchill watched this unfold with a familiar mix of concern and resolve. He did not seek the moment that followed, but he recognized it when it arrived. When the call came asking him to step forward once more, it did not feel like assent, it felt like obligation. The world had changed its tone, silence had broken, and with it, the space for delay. What remained was decision, spoken aloud, carried forward not by certainty, but by necessity. The quiet years were over. The long night was deepening, and as history turned sharply, Britain began, slowly and reluctantly, to listen again. By the early summer of 1940, Britain found itself standing in a narrowing circle of light. One by one, the familiar points of reference had disappeared. France was collapsing with stunning speed. Armies retreated, roads filled with refugees. The map of Europe was being redrawn, not with ink, but with movement and loss. Across the Channel, the storm gathered visibly now. There was no longer any need to imagine what might come. The threat was real, immediate, and unambiguous. Britain stood alone. For Churchill, this moment carried a particular weight. He had known isolation before, personally and politically, but this was different. This was the isolation of a nation suspended between invasion and survival. Every decision carried consequences that reached far beyond his own life. The margin for error had vanished almost entirely. Inside the War Cabinet, tension was constant. Voices rose and fell. Options were examined, then revisited, then questioned again. Some argued that negotiation remained possible, that survival might be secured through compromise. The idea was tempting. To negotiate was to imagine an end without further destruction, a way to step out of the storm before it broke fully overhead. Churchill listened carefully. He understood the fear beneath these arguments. He felt it himself. To reject negotiation was to accept suffering, perhaps on an unimaginable scale. Yet he also understood something else. Compromise, offered under threat, rarely preserved dignity or safety. It postponed loss, but deepened it. The storm outside did not pause for debate. German forces pressed forward relentlessly. The evacuation at Dunkirk unfolded under fire, an improbable rescue born of urgency and desperation. Small boats crossed dangerous waters, carrying exhausted soldiers back to English shores. It was a moment of relief, but not victory. The army had been saved, but its equipment was gone. The danger remained. Britain's defenses were thin, resources were strained, allies were absent. The United States watched from across the ocean, sympathetic but distant. Each night, Churchill returned to his papers aware that no external force would intervene in time. The responsibility rested entirely within the island. Leadership in these days meant resisting despair as much as directing action. Churchill understood the power of atmosphere, how quickly fear could spread if left unspoken or mishandled. He did not hide the danger, but he refused to let it dominate the imagination. He spoke of resistance, not as certainty, but as choice, a decision renewed each day. Privately, doubt never fully receded. He questioned whether endurance was enough, whether resolve could compensate for material disadvantage. He measured loss against possibility, knowing that neither offered comfort. Yet each morning he returned to the same conclusion. Survival required refusal. There could be no halfway ground. The storm pressed closer. Air raids loomed. Invasion plans circulated. Britain listened to the skies. The nation existed in a state of waiting, sharpened by awareness. And at the center of it all stood a man who had learned long ago how to remain steady in isolation. Churchill did not promise shelter from the storm. He promised only that Britain would face it standing, alone if necessary. This promise was not dramatic. It was quiet, deliberate, and heavy with consequence. Yet it gave shape to fear, transforming it into something that could be endured. As the clouds gathered and the nights lengthened, Britain held its breath. The storm was no longer approaching. It was already here, and in the absence of certainty, the country clung to a single, fragile anchor, the decision not to yield. As the days pressed forward, the burden Churchill carried grew heavier, not louder. There were no grand gestures to release it, no moment where responsibility could be set aside. It followed him through long meetings and later still through the quiet hours of the night, when the city slept lightly and the mind refused rest. The weight of a nation is not felt all at once. It accumulates. It settles into small decisions that cannot be undone, into sentences that must be spoken carefully because millions will hear them, and measure their own fear against them. Churchill understood this instinctively. He knew that leadership in moments like these was not about inspiring emotion, but about containing it. His days began early and ended late. Papers stacked on desks, maps marked and remarked. Messages arrived faster than they could be answered. Each carried fragments of a larger picture that never fully resolved. Information was incomplete, reports conflicted, and yet decisions could not wait for clarity. Churchill felt acutely the loneliness of command. He was surrounded by advisors, generals, ministers, yet the final responsibility rested with him alone. Advice could be weighed, debated, even rejected, but ownership could not be shared. Once a decision was made, it belonged to him, and so did its consequences. At night, when conversation fell away, doubt found more room to speak. He questioned whether resolve could outlast material disadvantage, whether morale could hold when comfort vanished. He thought of the families scattered across Britain, listening for sirens, adjusting to darkness, preparing for loss they could not yet imagine. Their unseen presence accompanied him constantly. Still, he did not allow doubt to paralyze him. He had learned through years of isolation and failure how to coexist with uncertainty. Confidence, he knew, was not the absence of fear, but the discipline of acting in spite of it. The weight he carried did not disappear. He simply learned how to stand beneath it. Churchill also understood the importance of continuity. Panic thrives in disruption. Routine, however fragile, offers stability. He maintained patterns where possible, regular meetings, familiar language, a steady cadence of communication. These were not habits of comfort, but of control. They reassured not because they promised safety, but because they signaled persistence. He paid careful attention to his words, aware that language could either fracture resolve or reinforce it. He avoided false optimism, but he also resisted despair. Between these extremes, he sought a tone that acknowledged hardship without surrendering to it. This balance was difficult and exhausting. Each speech, each statement, demanded precision. The weight of a nation also altered his sense of time. Days blurred, weeks compressed. The future narrowed to the next decision, the next response. The next night endured. Long-term victory felt distant, almost abstract. Survival, by contrast, was immediate and constant. In quieter moments, he reflected on the path that had led him here. The years of dismissal, the long wilderness, the failures that had once seemed only personal, now revealed their purpose. They had prepared him for this exact condition, a life lived under pressure without reassurance. The weight did not break him. It reshaped him. It stripped away any remaining illusions about control or certainty. What remained was something simpler and stronger. Responsibility accepted fully, without escape. Britain did not know the details of his nights or the depth of his doubts. It did not need to. What it felt instead was steadiness, a sense that someone was holding the center even as the edges frayed. Under the weight of a nation, Churchill stood not because he was unburdened, but because he had learned slowly and imperfectly how to carry what could not be set down. When Churchill rose to speak, he did not imagine the words echoing through history. He thought instead of the present moment, fragile and uncertain, and of the people listening not for inspiration, but for steadiness. Britain did not need poetry. It needed something firmer, something that could hold fear without denying it. The speeches came during a time of strain and exhaustion. The fall of France had shaken confidence. The evacuation at Dunkirk, remarkable as it was, had not erased the sense of danger. The enemy remained close. The future remained unclear. Churchill understood that what he said now would not merely inform, it would shape how the nation endured what lay ahead. He chose his words carefully. There would be no promise of ease, no illusion of quick victory. Instead, he spoke of effort, of struggle, of days that would test patience, and nights that would demand courage. This honesty mattered. People recognized it. They trusted words that did not flatter them. When he said, "We shall never surrender." It was not shouted, it was stated, a conclusion reached after reflection, not a declaration born of impulse. The power of the phrase lay not in its volume, but in its restraint. It named a decision already taken, quietly and collectively. Across Britain, people listened in kitchens, in factories, in rooms darkened by blackout curtains. Radios carried his voice into spaces shaped by waiting and worry. For many, the sound itself mattered as much as the message. It was steady, deliberate, unhurried. It did not rush toward hope. It stayed with reality. Churchill understood that language could create structure where circumstances offered none. His sentences moved carefully, building rhythm without urgency, allowing listeners to follow without being overwhelmed. Repetition was used not to excite but to reinforce. Each phrase settled into the mind, offering something solid to return to. These speeches did not erase fear, they gave it shape. They transformed anxiety into resolve, not by dismissing danger, but by acknowledging it openly. People felt seen in their apprehension, included rather than reassured away. This inclusion mattered deeply. It turned endurance into a shared act rather than a private burden. For Churchill himself, speaking brought no release. The words did not lighten the weight he carried. They clarified it. Once spoken, they became commitments that could not be withdrawn. He accepted this. Language to him was not ornament. It was responsibility made audible. He knew that words alone could not stop planes or prevent invasion. But he also knew that morale was not an abstraction. It lived in tone, in pacing, in the sense that someone was speaking with care rather than certainty. His voice became a point of continuity, a reminder that thought and resolve still existed even as the world fractured. As the speeches ended and radios went quiet, Britain returned to its routines of waiting and watching. The danger remained. The nights were still long, yet something subtle had shifted. People did not feel safer, but they felt steadier. They had been offered not escape, but alignment. "We shall never surrender" did not promise survival. It promised stance. It defined how Britain would meet whatever came next. In that definition, there was calm, and in calm, there was strength enough to endure another night. When the speeches ended and the doors closed, certainty did not follow Churchill into the quiet. Public resolve had its place, but it did not erase private doubt. In the stillness of late hours, away from microphones and listening crowds, questions returned with a persistence he could not silence. Churchill understood the difference between what must be shown and what must be borne. Leadership required composure, but it did not grant immunity from fear. Alone with his thoughts, he replayed decisions, reconsidered alternatives, and weighed outcomes that could not be tested in advance. The responsibility he carried left little room for rest. Doubt did not arrive as panic. It was quieter than that, more methodical. It asked whether endurance would be enough, whether resolve could hold against force, whether the country could survive not just invasion, but prolonged strain. These questions did not seek answers. They demanded attention. Late at night, with papers spread across his desk, and the city subdued beneath blackout, Churchill confronted the limits of control. Intelligence was imperfect, predictions conflicted, the future refused to clarify itself. He had learned long ago that hesitation could be dangerous, yet certainty was unavailable. Action had to proceed without assurance. He was keenly aware of the cost of his words. Each declaration of resistance narrowed the range of possible outcomes. To commit publicly was to close doors privately. Negotiation, once dismissed aloud, could not be reconsidered quietly without consequence. This awareness weighed heavily. Language, once spoken, could not be retrieved. Churchill spoke often of courage, but he did not confuse it with confidence. Courage to him meant remaining present to fear without allowing it to dictate action. Doubt was not an enemy to be eliminated. It was a condition to be managed, acknowledged, and contained. He found brief refuge in routine, familiar habits, small rituals, Moments of repetition helped steady the mind. These were not indulgences, but anchors. They provided structure when events refused to align. In such moments, the scale of responsibility narrowed just enough to be bearable. He also returned to writing, not for publication, but for clarity. Setting thoughts onto paper allowed him to examine them at a distance, to separate what could be influenced from what could not. Writing transformed unease into something tangible, something that could be faced rather than endured abstractly. Those closest to him sensed the strain, even when it was unspoken. They saw the fatigue, the long silences, the moments when his gaze lingered just beyond the present. Yet he did not allow doubt to escape into the open. He understood how quickly uncertainty could spread, how easily it could undermine resolve if given voice too freely. Behind closed doors, Churchill carried his questions alone. This solitude was not new. He had known it since childhood, since early failure, since the long years of political isolation. What was new was its scale. The doubt he now contained was not his own alone. It belonged to a nation, and yet each morning he returned to his role with the same measured steadiness. Doubt did not weaken him. It sharpened his awareness of consequence. It reminded him that leadership was not the absence of fear, but the discipline of proceeding despite it. The public heard resolve. The private rooms held uncertainty. Between these two spaces, Churchill lived and worked, carrying both without allowing either to dominate. In this balance, fragile and imperfect, he continued one decision at a time through a night that still had no clear end. There was no sudden turning point, no clear moment when danger receded and relief arrived. Instead, the war settled into something quieter and more exhausting. Days followed, days without decisive change. Nights passed without resolution. Victory remained distant, almost theoretical, while endurance became the daily measure of strength. Britain learned how to live inside uncertainty. Air raids came and went. Damage was repaired, then repaired again. People adjusted their lives around interruption, around the knowledge that plans could be erased without warning. The extraordinary became ordinary. Survival became routine. For Churchill, this period carried a particular strain. He understood that morale could not be sustained indefinitely by anticipation alone. Hope without progress risked wearing thin. Yet there was no alternative narrative to offer. The truth was simple and difficult. The war would be long, and there would be no easy reward for persistence. He continued to speak, but the tone shifted subtly. The urgency of defiance gave way to the steadiness of continuation. He spoke less of triumph and more of duty, less of destiny and more of effort. The language reflected reality. This was not a chapter of advance, but of holding ground. Endurance without victory tested patience in ways that moments of crisis did not. Crisis sharpened focus. Waiting dulled it. Churchill worried about fatigue, about the slow erosion of resolve that could occur when fear no longer shocked, but lingered quietly in the background. He watched carefully for signs of withdrawal, of resignation disguised as calm. Privately, he wrestled with the limitations of leadership in such a phase. There were fewer decisive actions to take, fewer moments where choice clearly altered direction. Much of his role became one of maintenance, sustaining systems, reinforcing commitments, preventing collapse rather than pursuing conquest. This was less visible work, but no less necessary. He reminded himself that endurance was not passive. To endure was to choose again each day, not to abandon effort. It required attention, adjustment, and constant reaffirmation. It demanded patience without complacency, vigilance without panic. The nation mirrored this discipline. People continued working, repairing, producing, waiting. Life did not pause for the war. it folded around it. This quiet continuation carried its own dignity. Churchill recognized this and honored it in his words. He spoke of ordinary effort as something meaningful, something that mattered precisely because it lacked spectacle. There were moments of doubt, of course. He questioned whether patience could hold indefinitely, whether sacrifice without visible gain would eventually hollow resolve. Yet he also knew that to promise progress where none existed would be more damaging than silence. In this long stretch without victory, Churchill relied on consistency. He maintained routines, reinforced alliances where possible, and avoided dramatic shifts that might unsettle fragile stability. Change, when it came, would come slowly. Until then, steadiness was itself an achievement. Endurance reshaped time. Weeks blurred. Months passed. The future remained uncertain, but the present became manageable. This narrowing of focus was not defeat. It was adaptation. It allowed Britain to persist without consuming itself in anticipation. Victory would come later, shaped by forces beyond immediate control. For now, survival was enough. To endure without victory was not failure. It was the necessary condition of eventual change. And in that understanding, quiet and uncelebrated, Britain continued, one day following another, through a war that demanded patience more than glory. The arrival of allies did not come with sudden light or celebration. It came gradually, almost cautiously, as if the world itself needed time to trust that help was truly on its way. For Britain and for Churchill, the shift was real, but it did not erase exhaustion. Relief, when it arrived, carried the weight of all that had already been endured. Across the Atlantic, the United States moved closer to involvement, step by careful step. At first there were supplies, conversations, shared concerns expressed in restrained language. Then, after Pearl Harbor, distance collapsed. The war widened, and with it came partnership. Britain was no longer alone in a literal sense, though the memory of isolation lingered. Churchill welcomed the alliance with gratitude, but not illusion. He understood that shared purpose did not dissolve difference, and that cooperation brought its own complexities. Strategy required negotiation. Priorities had to be aligned. Decisions became collective, and therefore slower. Relief was accompanied by responsibility. His relationship with President Franklin D. Roosevelt developed through correspondence and conversation, shaped by mutual respect and differing temperaments. Churchill wrote at length, carefully choosing tone and timing, aware that words still mattered deeply. He saw in Roosevelt not a savior but a partner, someone whose presence altered the balance without simplifying the task. For the nation, the knowledge that allies stood alongside them changed the emotional landscape. Fear loosened slightly. Anticipation replaced pure endurance. Yet the war did not pause to acknowledge this shift. Loss continued. Effort remained constant. The horizon widened, but the road did not shorten. Churchill felt the strain of transition. Leading alone demanded decisiveness without consultation. Leading together required patience, compromise, and trust. He adapted, as he always had, carrying forward the lessons of earlier isolation. Collaboration did not diminish responsibility, it redistributed it. Privately, he allowed himself moments of cautious hope, not triumph, not certainty, but the sense that endurance might now have direction. These moments were brief and carefully guarded. He knew too well how easily optimism could outrun reality. The alliance reshaped strategy, but it also reshaped time. The war became a longer arc rather than a single line of resistance. Planning extended further into the future. Consequence expanded. Decisions taken now would shape not only survival, but the world that followed. Churchill remained attentive to tone. He resisted the temptation to declare turning points too early. He spoke instead of shared effort, of sustained commitment, of work still to be done. The steadiness of his language reflected his understanding that alliances, like endurance, required maintenance. Britain listened differently now. The fear that had once narrowed attention eased just enough to allow perspective. People looked outward again, toward a world beyond immediate threat. This widening did not erase grief or fatigue, but it made room for something else alongside them. Allies had arrived, and with them came possibility. Not the promise of ease, but the promise of shared burden. For Churchill, this was enough. He had never believed in rescue. He believed in effort multiplied through cooperation. The long night was not over, but it was no longer born alone. And in that quiet shift, almost imperceptible at first, the shape of the future began slowly to change. The turning of the war did not arrive as a single moment that could be clearly named. It unfolded gradually, almost hesitantly, through small shifts in momentum that were felt before they were fully understood. News began to change its tone. Losses continued, but alongside them appeared signs of pressure easing, of resistance gaining shape. For Britain and for Churchill, this change required adjustment. For so long, effort had been focused on survival, on holding the line without expectation of progress. Now, the possibility of movement introduced a new kind of tension. Hope returned cautiously, aware of how fragile it could be. Military reports spoke of advances, of coordination across fronts, of strategies that extended beyond immediate defense. These developments mattered deeply, yet Churchill resisted the urge to frame them as conclusions. He had learned through experience and loss how dangerous premature certainty could be. Progress was acknowledged, but never exaggerated. The war, even as it turned, continued to demand patience. Victories were partial. Setbacks remained frequent. Each gain was measured against cost, and the cost was never abstract. Names arrived with reports. Numbers became faces. Churchill carried this awareness constantly, mindful that improvement did not erase sacrifice. Public language shifted subtly. The tone remained serious but no longer singularly defensive. There was room now for perspective, for the recognition that endurance might be shaping outcome rather than merely delaying defeat. This shift was quiet, restrained, and deliberate. Churchill felt the complexity of this phase acutely. Leadership during decline had demanded resolve without hope. Leadership during transition demanded restraint in hope itself. He understood that morale could be damaged not only by despair, but by expectation that rose faster than reality could support. Privately, he allowed himself moments of reflection. He thought of the early days, when isolation had defined every decision, when the future had narrowed to the next night endured. Those memories did not fade with progress. They grounded him, reminding him how easily direction could be lost. The nation, too, adjusted slowly. People continued their routines, still shaped by caution and fatigue. Celebration felt distant, almost inappropriate. The war had not softened them, it had aged them. Improvement, when it came, was received with quiet relief rather than joy. Churchill maintained the same discipline he had practiced throughout. He spoke carefully, avoided dramatic language, and emphasized continuity. The war turning was not an end, it was a change in current, one that required navigation as much as resolve. Allies coordinated more closely now. Planning extended further. The horizon widened again, not as promise, but as responsibility. Decisions taken in this phase would shape not only the war's conclusion, but the peace that followed. Churchill understood this weight. He approached it with the same caution he had learned in isolation. The turning, when seen from within, felt less like movement and more like balance regained after a long strain. It was subtle, uneven, and easily disrupted, yet it was real. The war was turning, slowly, not away from loss, but toward possibility. And in that slow turn, carried forward by patience rather than triumph, the long work of endurance began to reveal its shape. When victory finally came, it did not arrive as rest. The fighting ended, the weapons fell silent, and yet the world did not exhale all at once. Too much had been endured, too much altered, for peace to feel simple or complete. What followed was quieter than war, but not lighter. For Britain, the end of the conflict brought relief mixed with exhaustion. Cities bore scars that would not fade quickly. Families counted absences that could not be repaired. The future opened again, but it did so cautiously, as if uncertain how to move without the constant pressure of survival. Churchill stood at the center of this moment, publicly associated with endurance and resolve. His voice, so long tied to resistance, now spoke into a space shaped by memory and loss. The words sounded different here. They no longer carried the urgency of survival, but they could not yet offer ease. Victory, he understood, did not erase the past. It only ended one chapter of it. There was also an unexpected quiet that followed the end of war. For years, attention had been fixed outward, focused on threat and response. Now, that focus dissolved, leaving room for questions that had been postponed. What kind of country would Britain become? What sacrifices would be honored and which would be forgotten? These questions carried no immediate answers. Churchill faced a personal turning that surprised many and perhaps unsettled him as well. In the election that followed victory, he was voted out of office. The decision was not a rejection of his leadership in war, but an expression of a nation ready to turn its attention inward. People wanted rebuilding, reform, and a different kind of guidance. The transition was abrupt, one day defined by command, the next by distance. Churchill accepted the result with outward composure, but the shift carried weight. The war had given his life clear structure and purpose. Its end removed that framework, leaving space that felt unfamiliar and quiet. He returned to writing, to reflection, to the habits that had sustained him in earlier periods of isolation. The solitude was different now. It was no longer imposed by neglect or danger, but by change. History had moved forward, and with it, the roles assigned to those who had shaped it. Victory without peace revealed a difficult truth. Ending conflict does not immediately restore balance. The mind lingers in vigilance. The body remembers strain. Nations, like individuals, need time to relearn stillness. Churchill reflected on what had been achieved and what had been lost. He understood that leadership during crisis did not guarantee continuity afterward. Moments of necessity pass, and with them, the need for certain kinds of voices. This realization did not diminish his contribution, but it reframed it. The world he helped preserve was not the world he would lead into peace. That task belonged to others. His role, once central, now receded. The applause faded. The silence returned. Victory had come, but peace remained incomplete. It would require patience, reconstruction, and forgetting that could not be rushed. For Churchill, this meant accepting another form of solitude, one shaped not by danger, but by transition. The war was over. The long night had lifted, yet dawn, when it arrived, was muted and uneven, revealing a landscape changed beyond recognition. And in that altered light, Churchill stepped back, carrying with him the quiet knowledge that some burdens end not with triumph, but with release. With time, the noise of war faded into memory, and what remained were echoes, not the sharp sounds of conflict, but the quieter traces left behind in language, in habit, in the way a nation remembered how it had endured. For Winston Churchill, this period was marked less by action than by reflection, less by command than by distance. He lived on, older now, watching the world he had helped preserve take new shape. The urgency that once defined every day was gone, replaced by a slower rhythm that allowed thought to wander. He wrote, painted, spoke occasionally, and observed. The center had shifted, and he stood slightly to the side of it, no longer directing events, but aware of their movement. Churchill understood that history rarely settles cleanly. It leaves fragments rather than conclusions. The speeches that once steadied a nation now existed independently of him, quoted, remembered, sometimes simplified. They had become part of a larger memory, detached from the nights in which they were written and the doubts that had accompanied them. What endured most clearly was not victory itself, but stance, the decision to resist, the refusal to look away. These choices echoed long after circumstances changed. They were carried forward by others who had listened in darkened rooms, who had learned in those moments how to endure uncertainty without surrendering to it. In private, Churchill returned often to quiet. He had never believed that peace meant absence of struggle. It meant the chance to live without constant fear, to think without immediate threat. This too required adjustment. Silence, after years of intensity, could feel unfamiliar. Yet he accepted it, recognizing it as another phase rather than an ending. He reflected on the path that had brought him there. The lonely child, the struggling student, the young officer hearing gunfire for the first time. The years of isolation, the warnings unheeded, the sudden weight of leadership. None of it appeared accidental in retrospect. Each stage had prepared him, imperfectly but sufficiently, for what followed. Churchill did not imagine himself as a hero. He saw himself as someone who had stood where standing was required. The voice that had once filled the airwaves now existed mostly in memory, an echo shaped by time and distance. And yet that echo retained its purpose. It reminded people that resolve could be quiet, that courage did not always announce itself loudly. As the years passed, the world moved on, as it always does. New challenges emerged, new voices rose. The moment that had defined him receded into history. This did not diminish it. It placed it where it belonged, among the many instances where individuals had met circumstances larger than themselves and chosen not to yield. In the end, Churchill's legacy was not certainty, but steadiness, not triumph without cost, but endurance without illusion. His words did not promise safety. They offered companionship in difficulty, a sense that fear could be faced without denial. And so, as the night finally deepens and the story draws to a close, what remains is not the sound of battle or applause, but the softer echo of a voice that once spoke into darkness and helped others remain standing until morning came.